G'day everyone, and welcome back to Home Group Help. It's study 8 in our series in the book of 1 Samuel. Now, as you're preparing this study, I will have preached on 1 Samuel 16 and 17, the famous story of David and Goliath, but emphasising chapter 16, looking at the introduction of David and seeing how there's a big contrast between Saul, who refuses to obey the word of the Lord, and David, who is obedient. It's shown very clearly that partial obedience in God's eyes is no obedience at all. It's actually disobedience. And so it's crazy for us to be trusting in ourselves rather than having confidence in a great God. And so again, as you're helping people to reflect on the sermon, we want you to be helping people to see that this is something that we need to be doing, not because God's forcing us to, but because that's where the ability to be able to do things actually comes from. It's not in ourselves, but it's in the great God that we serve. And so it is a great encouragement that obedience is the right response. Obedience is the appropriate response because God knows what's best, and we can rely and trust in Him. And so we need to be encouraging one another to be applying that to all of our lives. Not to be pulling ourselves up by the bootstraps as if our obedience somehow merits something, but seeing obedience as the appropriate response to Jesus and what He's done for us. In terms of the study that we're looking at today, chapters 18 through to 20, the big idea is that allegiance to God is a higher priority than even family. And in our society, in our time, obviously family is incredibly important, and it can be given sometimes even too high a priority, that family comes first and God takes just the second best of leftovers. And what this passage is no doubt anticipating is things that Jesus will say about family and our need to prioritise our relationship with God first, being in line with God and His desires, rather than pushing for our family to have what we think will keep them going in the future. And so that this is going to come out through the story of the response to David. David is continuing his rise to power, to being the king that's recognised by all Israel, and yet Saul's family are responding to David in different ways. In 1 Samuel 18 verses 1 to 9, we have this strong contrast between King Saul's response to David and his son Jonathan, the crown prince's reaction. Jonathan is wholehearted in his support of David. He loves him. He makes a covenant with him. He gives his clothes and his weapons, which are very probably almost an abdication of the throne, recognising that David is the anointed one. This is the one who has been chosen by God to be the next king. And Jonathan's not going to stand in the way of that. Even though power could come to him if he fought for it, he realises that this is an appointment by God, and therefore he's not going to get in the way. Saul, in obvious contrast, has become in love with power, and he wants to see that power pass on to his son and then their sons. And this whole idea of kingship is tied up with this whole idea of the descendants taking over the throne from the father, and that being part of what having a king means. And yet a king in Israel is different, because the king is anointed by the prophet at the word of the Lord, and therefore Jonathan recognises this, but Saul clearly doesn't. In verses 20 to 29, it's not just Jonathan who is enamoured by David. Clearly, Saul's two daughters are played off very, very sadly. Saul's even willing to use his daughter as some kind of a pawn in his game. And so we need to recognise that this request in the second case for a dowry of 100 Philistine foreskins is no doubt Saul's attempt at murder by enemy army. Saul doesn't want to raise his hand against David because it could come out in the public that Saul killed David, and so Saul was scared of David. But if David just happens to fall in a battle with the Philistines, well, that was just bad luck. It was unfortunate, wasn't it? And so we need to recognise in this, as people who are familiar with the story, that it's very, very similar to what David does with Uriah, the husband of Bathsheba. After he commits adultery, he sends Uriah off to war and has him killed. But the prophet Nathan will clearly accuse David that this was not just an accident, this was murder. And so it's a terrible indication of desperation and an unwillingness to listen to God and do things his ways. In chapter 19, verses 1 to 7, Jonathan befriends and protects David. And again, it's just emphasising this whole idea of, well, why would Jonathan do this? And the motivation is clearly love. There's multiple verses that speaks to this. Chapter 18, verses 1 and 3, chapter 19, verse 1, chapter 20, verse 3. He loves him. He makes a covenant with him. He befriends him. He's looking after him. And the word in chapter 20, verse 3 is the same word that's talked about God's love, his covenant faithfulness for Israel. And so that's the kind of way that Jonathan's looking after and protecting. They have this unbreakable bond of faithfulness and care for one another. Initially, what this means is that David is restored to his role as Saul's servant. Right back in chapter 17, David has been happy, 16 and 17, David has been happy to be Saul's servant, and he continues to be willing to play that role as long as Saul's willing to let him do that. Chapter 19, verse 6, Saul speaks better than he knows. And one of the things that we see throughout Saul's life, right from the time when he was chasing after the donkeys, and then he's anointed by Samuel, he goes away and the Spirit of the Lord comes on him, which results in him prophesying. Prophesying probably not in the sense of predicting the future or telling what God says is going to happen in the future, but certainly speaking out God's word. And so the Spirit comes on in power upon Saul and makes him say things which are beyond his ability to know. And here he says, as surely as the Lord lives, David will not die. And yet over the coming chapters, Saul's whole life is going to be all about trying to kill David. And yet because the Lord lives and because the Lord is on David's side, he's absolutely right. There's no possible way that David can die because men cannot stand against God. There's no way that Saul can fulfill his plan to get rid of this person who will come and take the throne because God is on his side. And it's a fascinating contrast, whereas Jonathan has recognised David's anointing, David being empowered by the Spirit of the Lord, David having the Lord on his side is a good thing and therefore something that Jonathan needs to get behind. Saul, it's repeated in a number of places, is afraid of the fact that the Lord is with David because it means and confirms that the Lord is not with Saul. And so Saul's reaction here is a very sad one in which he's trying to hang on to this power that he's been given, but unwilling to recognise that God's taken it off him. The grey box at the top of page 39 is obviously not supposed to be there. It's linked to the previous study where the Spirit of the Lord was taken away from Saul in chapter 16. And so just ignore that in terms of this study. In terms of chapter 19, verses 11 to 18, how is David rescued from a human perspective? Well, very fascinatingly, his wife, the daughter of Saul, is the one who brings about the rescue. Now, clearly David never said anything about threatening her life, and yet she has to use means in order to keep her dad happy, that she's not a traitor. And so David's rescued by his wife. And yet in the very next verses, 19, 18 to 24, clearly human means are not even necessary because God's very capable of rescuing David, fulfilling the prophecy that Saul said that David's not going to die. And so again, in line with what we've seen before, the Spirit comes upon, first of all, Saul's men, but then Saul himself, and it turns them from opposition into prophets. Very, very clearly showing the power of the Spirit of God is able to overwhelm anybody. Now, clearly through this passage or chapters of the Bible, Saul and his children are having very different responses. And we've got to ask the question, well, why is Saul so wrong? Why is he so mistaken? Why is he so driven? And I think that the reality has to be underlined is that he ignores the fact that David is the new anointed. Saul has been given power in the past, and he wants to hang on to it. And so he will do whatever he can in order to retain that power. Saul's children, on the other hand, recognize what's taken place. They recognize that there's no point in trying to hang on to power because God's not with them. God's not going to support the things they're doing. And so why would you try and stand up against God? To stand up against David is to stand against God. And so Saul's children have understood this. They've aligned themselves with what God's plans are rather than trying to hang on to their own plans. In terms of pushing this to application for us, obviously we're not directly involved in appointing kings or playing the power politics that we're hearing going on in these chapters. And yet there's still clearly principles for us that are related to God's sovereignty and human planning. Clearly we need to align ourselves with what God is doing. And yet that doesn't mean that we sit back passively and don't do anything because God's in control. Our activity is sometimes used by God as the means by which his plans are brought into being. Sometimes he'll act supernaturally so that there's nothing that we even needed to do. It's a tricky situation to work out, well, in this case, what do I need to do? And so clearly there's not an obvious, okay, this is one that God looks after, or this is one that I look after. As we're doing things, it doesn't mean that God's not involved in them. God's involved through us. And so we need to be trusting in him, but also recognizing that there's some things that are outside of our control and that we can't do anything. And so be willing to allow God to act in those situations independent of us. The final question, making reference to Luke 14, verse 26, tries to bring this home so that we think about, well, how can we be making the right response to God's anointed? How can we be making the right response to God's plans and the things that he's put into place? And clearly it's showing that family allegiance is important. It's incredibly important to love our family and to look after them. And yet clearly the highest priority is God. And so if we're going to love our family best, it will be through loving God, putting him first, putting his priorities first. And as we do those things, it will mean that we love our family better. Depending on who is in your group, this is going to be tricky in terms of application. If people are older and their kids are older, how do they interact with their kids and continue them on the right path, particularly for kids that have walked away from the church? For families with kids at home, thinking through how do parents encourage their kids to be making the most out of Sunday school, coming along to youth group, being there at church on a regular basis. How does this interact with sport on Sundays, with music practice or extra studies? We can take things that are good and they can drift into becoming idols, that we so emphasize those things that the kids have got no time for doing things that are helping them to grow in their relationship with God. And so this is a really tricky issue on which there's no clear boundaries that you say this is right and this is wrong. We have to be going back and checking our motivations. And so as groups, we can be encouraging one another. If you've got people in your group with no kids, this obviously doesn't mean that you're off the hook and because in some sense they are a child of their family, but also they can have interaction with kids at the church, and so they can be a part of the church community, bringing up kids and encouraging them to be focusing on Jesus. As always, we want you to spend the end of your time in a group continuing to pray through these things. They're not easy issues. Obedience from the previous sermon, thinking through prioritising God even higher than family is a challenging concept. And so pray through these things, asking God to reveal to us where do we stand on these things and how can we improve? Are there issues that we have to change? Continuing to pray for situations in each one's life. We're recognising our dependence on God, but also our desire to carry one another's burdens. Continuing to pray for those that we know that as yet don't trust in Jesus. Again, I hope this has been a helpful time just working through the questions. If you have got further questions, then please feel free to get in contact. Otherwise, see you again next week. Bye for now.